Welcome to the Gottesdienst Crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst Crowd. This is Jason Broughton, your host. Today we have back with us Mark Braden. He is the pastor of Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church in Detroit, Michigan, and an editor of the print journal with his recurring column, Taking Pains. Welcome back, Mark.
Greetings, and greetings from the city of Detroit as well.
Excellent. So today we're trying something a bit different, something we haven't done on the Gottesdienst Crowd yet, something I've been kind of wanting to do for a little bit, is we're going to do some biographical sketches of some important liturgical authors and kind of liturgical, for lack of a better way of saying it, revivalists within the Lutheran Church. So today we're going to look at Luther Reed. Now, he's probably best known for his tome entitled The Lutheran Liturgy. But Mark, you have done some yeoman's work in looking into his past and also his work. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the man, and then we'll look at his work.
I'd be glad to. Thank you. This is a point of great personal enjoyment because I've read Reed since 1999. I was actually really introduced to him in 2002 by Father David Peterson, one of the more important editors of our publication. And Peterson had worship and the Lutheran liturgy in his library, and I had the opportunity to read them as I vicared under Father Peterson. That would have been back, in the last century. And so it's a joy, actually, after this many years of reading Reed, to share a little bit about him. He is Luther D. Reed. The D stands for Daughterer, and he was born in North Wales, Pennsylvania in 1873, and he lived 99 years. He died in 1972. Reed was a great churchman. He was a liturgical reformer of the 20th century, and Reed left to us a rich heritage drawn from the Reformation and from the Church of the Ages, as we'll discuss. And he also left 4 books that should be central to every Lutheran pastor's library, and we will name those books and talk about them, and then a little bit later talk about some books written by Reed that we haven't touched on, and then also some books written about Reed. So probably most famously, Reed was the president of Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia for 7 years, beginning in 1938. That is also known as the Philadelphia Seminary. It was founded in the middle of the 19th century, and it was really an extension of the Pennsylvania Ministerium, which was founded 100 years earlier by Muhlenberg. It is one of 8 seminaries that have been associated with what is now the ELCA, and 8 different Lutheran bodies participated in the service book and hymnal, which was the initiative for that hymnal was led by Luther Reed. So in addition to being the president of the seminary, he was also the president of the Associated Bureaus of Church Architecture, both in the U.S. and Canada. He was the founder and president of the Lutheran Liturgical Association, vice president of the Hymn Society of America. He served on numerous committees for the National Council of Churches of Christ, honorary member of the AGO, the American Guild of Organists, talented musician, honorary member of the Church Architectural Guild, and in addition to his earned doctorate, he held 4 honorary doctorates. The back cover of his title, Worship, gives a brief biographical sketch, and it says that Reed remembered the days when a young minister had to argue for the use of a black gown and an altar. So He served at a time of liturgical depravity in Lutheranism. He was professor of liturgics at the seminary for 34 years. In 1907, he served as the secretary of the Church Book Committee. That committee reached back and took the common service, which was done in English in the 19th century, and it used the common service as the basis for the new hymnal, Common Service Book with Hymnal. And Luther Reed participated in that. He was the chairman of the Joint Commission 50 years later that prepared the service book and hymnal. In the midst of what was called the frontier tradition, that is, Lutherans in log cabins, with the assistance of many others, he helped Lutherans in America recover their liturgical inheritance. That's a quote from one of his inside covers. So he served as chairman of Conference of Churches in New York in 1936, and he urged that they seriously pay attention to church architecture. And he contended publicly that most new churches were total artistic losses, representing pathetical financial wastes. So he was a little bit sharp of tongue at the same time.
So what kind of church architecture was he coming across that he would make such a rebuke about what was happening at that time?
The construction of modern churches that weren't giving attention to the purpose for the church. So Reed ties the architecture to liturgy, and he provides photos actually in his volume Worship of properly done churches that are appropriate settings for liturgy. So what's going on is they're forgetting the liturgy, or they're making the liturgy unimportant, as if that were possible, and they're building churches architecturally that neglect liturgical appointment. So he rails against that.
So it's kind of similar to what you find in Lang's Ceremony and Celebration, with the pictures from modern buildings versus ancient buildings.
Yes. And Reed does give some, of course, they're black and white in that publication, but he gives some great photos of properly constructed churches. In 1954, now this is obviously much later, at a meeting in Knoxville of the National Joint Conference on Church Architecture, he was given an award for his contributions to the advancement of better church design in the United States. So what I'm trying to do there is just show you that as a churchman, his contributions were multifaceted, not only liturgy, not only music, but also architecture. Reed wrote a hymn. The tune is called Mount Airy, and that is tied to the address of the seminary in Philadelphia, and that is on Mount Airy. And then he also translated parts of a hymn that we're familiar with, O Little Flock, Fear Not the Foe. And his title was Be Not Dismayed, Thou Little Flock. It's in the Common Service Book. It's hymn 196. And it carries, in recognition to Reed, it is placed right next to a mighty fortress in the Common Service Book. He also wrote the hymn, O God of Wondrous Grace and Glory, which is a CSB hymn. He wrote in 1947 a work called Luther and Congregational Song that was published by the General Council Publication Board, and it has a 1910 date, but the most recent one was 47. So Reed is the principal author, or participated in the production of 4 important books, and I mentioned those earlier, and I'd like to give the titles in a brief discussion of what's in each book.
Sure. Before we get there, though, what about a little bit of his childhood? I mean, how did he, if you know this, how did he come into wanting to be a pastor? Was his father a pastor? And, where was he trained? and how did he see to place the importance on church architecture, the liturgy, and the delivery of God's word and sacrament within that triangular understanding?
He is very steeped in initially the tradition of the Reformation. He writes about that a lot. He's very influenced by that. But by the time he gets to service book and hymnal, he is much more interested in the ancient liturgies, the Greek and Latin liturgies, and actually brings portions of them into service book and hymnal. And from there, they show up in Lutheran worship and LSB. I would refer questions about his life, or early life as growing up, to an author, and his name is Philip Fattiker, and he has a CPH title that is in print right now. You can go to CPH and get it, and it's called Luther Reed, The Legacy of a Gentleman and a Churchman. So there's actually a book about Reed. That's not something that I've spent a lot of time in. I've spent much more time in the books that Reed wrote. But I do know
that's fine.
that his immediate influence, and he talks about this a lot. He talks about the development of the common service as being something not of America, but of the Reformation in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes back to the old church books, the old church agenda, and he sees this commonality among churches of the Reformation. Now, it's interesting that Leah does the same thing. In Leah's agenda, he claims to have researched his ordo in 200 Reformation church agendas. And so Reed is influenced by that. He names Leah in a couple of his writings. And then later, though, as you draw nearer to the 50s and the service book and hymnal, he really goes for the old Greek liturgies. And that's why you get the old Greek, what we might call a Kyrie, and peace let us pray to the Lord. Lord, have mercy from the peace that is from above, etc. That Reed brings that into service book and hymnal. That's where that comes in. And then it shows up in our Lutheran worship and our LSB. And that influence comes from the old Greek church. Now, he also mentions repeatedly, as far as an influence, the Orbis Factor setting of the ordinary, and that is the Mass in the Latin. That is the 11th setting of the Mass, and the 11th setting of the Mass is the Mass for ordinary time. So it's all Gregorian chants, all Latin, and it is the Mass that picks up for de tempore, for the season of the church.
Okay.
So maybe that addresses a little bit the question of the influences.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful in terms of kind of where he, got this idea that he wanted to, go down that road. It makes sense that, he's born 10 years before the common service is actually put together, during the time when it's being constructed.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going back to all the various German liturgies and trying to figure out, what are the common elements and what are the distinct elements, and how should we weigh the various church orders to figure out where we're going to place it in our common service. So that makes sense, going back to those sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but so I think he's pretty honest about that. In fact, in the service book and hymnal, they actually place in the credit lines the Missa Orbis Factor as being the source of a number of their different chants. So if I can just start to touch now, and what I'll do is just summarize some of the contents of those 4 books, and then I certainly am open to questions and comments. The first that I would like to do is the Common Service book. Now that draws from the 1888 Common Service, which is translated into English, and then it adds to it several settings and a hymnal, and that is published in 1917 by the United Lutheran Church of America. That's the first book, and that's the Common Service Book with Hymnal. You can get that at Abe Books. The copies are floating around out there. The second is a read title, and that is The Lutheran Liturgy, a study of the common liturgy of the Lutheran Church in America. Has a 1947 publication date, and that is from Fortress Press of Philadelphia. The next title that I'd like to address is called Worship, a Study of Corporate Devotion. And in my estimation, TLL and Worship are Reed's greatest works. Worship has a 1959 publication date from Muhlenberg Press. And then lastly, the Service Book and Hymnal of 1958. And signing off on that were 8 different Lutheran church bodies and 4 printing presses. So it was quite a work that was meant to unify the worship of the Lutherans in America. So beginning with the Common Service Book of the Lutheran Church, this initially, as it was published, claimed to be the one hymnal for all English-speaking Lutherans. It was the General Synod of the South and the General Synod and the General Council that got together to do this hymnal. It was proposed 1878, and it was published 1888 is the version that I'm holding in my hand. And it talks about the common service in terms of Luther's reform of the Mass. And in that reference, they would be referring to the Formula Missae of 1523. But also the use of that form, that ordo, in the German church agendas of the Reformation. But they're very honest, and they include a very interesting history of liturgical renewal and the liturgy in the Common Service Book. And they also tip the hat to Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Book of Common Prayer, because they draw from his language as they move out of German and into English. But even in the Book of Common, in the Common Service Book, so 1888, they're calling the church the one holy Catholic Christian church with a capital C in Catholic. So they're really looking at this from a historic perspective, and they rightly understand the use of the term Catholic. They weren't afraid of it at all, and they employ it in that 1888 edition. So one of my favorite parts about CSB, Common Service Book, is in the first 2 plates, they have this beautiful churchly liturgical calendar. It's published on facing pages, and I actually have a photocopy of it hanging on the wall next to my desk in my study from which I'm speaking. And I use that because it is the historic lectionary. The service itself is a sung setting of what we would know as the page 15 liturgy of Lutheran Hymnal of 1941, but the music is different. The setting opens not, though, with the corporate confession and absolution, but rather with what we would know as the TLH page 5 declaration of grace. So the public absolution is simply the declaration, he who believes and is baptized. So there's that wonderful declaration of grace rather than the public absolution.
So does this mean, or should we conclude from that they still held in pretty high place private confession and absolution?
Yes, although no rite that I'm aware of is present in CSB. There is a preparatory rite for public confession that's given after the settings of the divine service in the occasional services, but I'm not aware of a private confession rite. Of course, Luther's would have been available to them, and they were students of Luther, so that may have been what they used. Interestingly, right away, as the Alleluia in the Divine Services is presented on page 15 of Common Service Book, they offer a tract for penitential seasons. There are two different settings given for the offertory, and that's on page 17 if anyone's following on that. And the first is the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. The second is the create in me a clean heart, O God, from Psalm 51. So historically, the offertory was never a proper. It was always an ordinary. It was different every week. And they recognize that, I guess, in some level by offering a choice between two offertories. The CSB also in the communion liturgy offers the difference, offers both the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed, and later in the divine service, it allows for the antecommunion. That is, you get all the way up to the communion liturgy, and then you don't have Holy Communion. So presumably, their use of the Apostles' Creed would have been when communion wasn't received. The Nicene Creed for the use of that service when communion is received. It does make the Nunc Dimittis a proper. The communio and the post communion were always were always propers. It makes them an ordinary. It puts it in and makes it the same every Sunday. But it also has Luther's post communion collect. At the end of the divine service, we give thanks to the Almighty God that thou hast refreshed us. So it's a wonderful representation of the 1523 Latin Mass in English with notation, and basic rubrics are provided. CSB also includes both Matins and Vespers, propers for the church year, with the readings printed in full. So you don't have to have a second book. The readings are printed out, although there are no Old Testament readings, which is common also to Lutheran hymnal. There is a combined Passion history that is broken into 7 distinct parts: order for the baptism of children, order for the baptism of adults, an order for confirmation, the order of public confession, a burial rite, a marriage rite, an ordination rite, an installation rite, the order for the laying of a cornerstone, order for the dedication of a church, order for opening and closing synods of the church, in order for installing the church council. There's a several-page section on the general rubrics, both for the divine service and for the offices. And then there is a calendar that includes a system for ranking of feasts. And at the end of the section of 578 hymns, there's a children's section. So, I mean, it's a very complete church book.
Mm-hmm.
So the next, so that's just a kind of a brief overview of the Common Service book with hymnal. And the copy that I'm holding carries 2 dates: 1917 by the ULCA, United Lutheran Church in America, 1918 again by the ULCA, and so that's it's at least 101 years old this year.
Mm-hmm.
The second book that I'd kind of like to just touch on, if I may, is the book called The Lutheran Liturgy. And this is a study of the common liturgy of the Lutheran Church in America. Now, the first thing I think that's interesting, as I gave the date earlier, 1947, this is also the title for the Lutheran Hymnals Altar Book. So it's a fairly ambitious title because Lutheran Hymnal was published before this. And to call this book TLL is, well, maybe even a bit presumptuous. Reed is a little hard on Missouri in his writings for not being part of the SB&H project, so Service Book and Hymnal Project. And I think naming this the Lutheran Liturgy a few years after the Lutheran Liturgy was the name of Missouri's altar book shows a little bit of the way they felt about Missouri at the time.
Some things
Uh,
change and some things never change.
that's exactly right. Yeah. So we have before us the Lutheran liturgy, and it opens up with this wonderful quote from the first Christmas sermon of Martin Luther that says, "Anyone who is to find the church, excuse me, who is to find Christ, must first find the church." And the church is not wood and stone, but it is the company of people who believe in Christ. And that's how they introduced this book by Luther Reed. And this is very much Luther in his translation of the Greek, rather than rendering ecclesia Kirche or Kirche. He renders it Gemeinde, the congregation. For Luther, the church is the believers gathered around the means of grace. It's not a hierarchy. And that's how Reed opens his book, The Lutheran Liturgy. It is a comprehensive study of the origins and the development of the liturgy of the Christian church, and he includes the early and medieval churches. And so he begins here really with a study of the Reformation and Lutheran church orders. And after he does that, in he spends almost 25 pages on the early church. He spends 20 pages on the medieval church, and then he's got a good 20 pages on the development of the German liturgies, and also then he's got another good 20 pages on the Lutheran church orders, and then he's got another good 15 pages on Swedish church orders of the Reformation, and then Anglican and Lutheran liturgies considered together. And here he talks about the fact that the Book of Common Prayer was influenced by Lutheran sensibilities. And he talks about the differences and the similarities. And really, he makes the claim that the Lutheran liturgy is closer to the historic liturgies. And so he's almost 150 pages in by the time he gets to speaking about American Lutheran liturgies. And he talks in that section about the American Lutheran liturgies. He talks in that section about the pioneer settings. He talks about Muhlenberg, the early American Lutheran liturgies, where they were taken from. And then he names 5 or 6 other important early liturgies in American Lutheranism. He talks about the Ministerium of New York and the revival there in the liturgical developments, and the other synods he discusses, and then the Church Book of the General Council in 1868, moving forward then, after about spending 20 pages on that, towards the Common Service, and then the Common Service book, which we've discussed. And he jumps from that to the Common Liturgy of 1958, which is going to be the basis for his real commentary after 200 pages. He's going to comment on the liturgy as we find it in service book and hymnal. So you're into this almost 200 pages before he introduces the service book and hymnal and begins to talk about it.
So you mentioned that he discusses a little bit about worship and Lutheranism on the frontier.
Yes, he does. He's in the 8th chapter of his book, which, if you're holding it, begins on page 161, outlines what he identifies as the pioneer conditions of the church.
Now, it's been so long since I've read this book, and I probably have only read it piecemeal, so I'm not sure if I actually have read that chapter. But does he talk about, because one of the claims that I'm sure you're well aware of now is that we need to get rid of the liturgy because we're in sort of this time where we're kind of a post-church time like the apostles were in. and we need to jettison the liturgy in order to be more evangelistic. Does he address that in that chapter and the importance of maintaining a liturgical and specifically a Lutheran liturgical heritage?
Well, he certainly talks about these struggles between the Dutch Reformed and the Lutherans, and that it was important for them to remain separate, and that the Lutherans retained their own liturgical tradition. So the first Lutherans in America were from Holland and Sweden, and he names those groups. They would have been very familiar with the Dutch Reformed, and he talks about their settlements in Delaware and Pennsylvania and how they remain distinct from the Dutch Reformed, and that's important to the transmission of the liturgy of their fathers to their children in the church. The pioneer condition language deals with the scattering over a wide territory, and the Germans come in the first half of the 18th century, and then he begins to discuss, the influence of the Germans as they come. But I think certainly Reed is supporting the idea that the retention of the liturgy by the Lutherans is key to their retaining the theology of the Lutheran Church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was
Uh,
part and parcel of the common service.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And he's gone through Muhlenberg's diary. He talks about Muhlenberg's diary as a source, and then he establishes, if you're holding a copy, around page 167, depending on the printing, uh, the outline of the typical Lutheran order that had, he says here, changed little since the Reformation. Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, Jonas, Myconius, Spalatin, Chemnitz, Arndt, he cites as being the fathers of this outline that he presents, and we would know that as basically the common service.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to discuss other early American liturgies. So by the time we get to 1958, he's going to use the rest of this to really deal with the ordinary and propers of service book and hymnal. And we're going to talk about the service book and hymnal last, but I can just give you kind of an overview and a sense of how he continues in TLL, the Lutheran liturgy. So he goes through the service in detail. He talks about all the ordinaries and the propers and where they come from. And for the Lutheran pastor, this discussion of where these things come from is very valuable. It's a remarkable read. It's worth every week as you study the propers of the historic Lutheran liturgy. As you look back to read, you can see where these collects are drawn from and some of the history behind the propers for every week. Is very interesting. And then he presents matins and vespers in detail, and then he goes through 200 pages of explanations of the propers, broken up into the parts of the liturgical year. And then he ends with a discussion of the historic Lutheran use of the litany and also the suffrages and their inclusion in the Lutheran liturgy as it is presented in service book and hymnal. So the first two books that I wanted to talk about were Common Service Book and The Lutheran Liturgy, a study of the common liturgy of the Lutheran Church in America. The third is the title called Worship, a Study of Corporate Devotion. And this is Reed's history of worship, and he begins with a very interesting foreword and talks about worship as an experience and an institution. And so he opens with this statement that worship has to be individual, but it can't be only individual.
Mm.
And so he distinguishes between individual devotion and corporate devotion, and then bases his title on corporate devotion. And he does that by opening up with, some 10 what he calls spirits or attitudes that are appropriate to the worship of the triune God. And so he makes this statement: the first important thing about worship that it is more than an experience of an individual, but it must at the same time be an individual experience. And then he talks about these attitudes or spirits, and he says that for worship to be appropriate and reverent, there has to be a spirit of obedience, a spirit of reverence, a spirit of communion, a spirit of fellowship, a spirit of sacrifice, a spirit of celebration, a spirit of edification. That worship must relate the gospel to life, and that lastly, there must be a spirit of permanence. And that goes in both directions. That which we receive, we pass on. So he does that in an introduction of about 9 pages, and he sets the stage for a discussion that's really couched in the ancient church and moving forward in the approach to the divine service. So in his first section after that, he deals with the form and the content of worship. And he begins with a church architecture chapter. And he's got photos, as I mentioned before. He talks about the church year and the importance of the seasons of the church year in catechesis.
Hmm.
He spends an entire chapter on liturgy as the important core or center of worship. He touches on, in one chapter, of course, he goes back to service book and hymnal, and he talks about service book and hymnal. In 2 chapters, he breaks the divine service in 2 parts, and he describes the liturgy of the divine service in detail in both parts. He talks about the rubrics, he talks about the theology. It's a wonderful section for the Lutheran pastor to read. And then he goes into the next major section of his book, and that major section deals with church music. And it is an extensive section, and he calls it the ministry of music. And he again goes back to what he calls the thread of history about the music of the church. And he talks about how the church views music, and then he distinguishes 3 different kinds of music: the music of the liturgy, the music of the hymn, and the music of the choir. And he treats each of those in a different section. And those sections are, 11 or 12 pages long. And then I mentioned in his biographical information that he was an AGO member, American Guild of Organists. He goes into the organ, and he treats the organ in 2 chapters. One, the history of the organ, which for somebody like me who's not a musician, that is very interesting. And then the liturgical requirements and use of the organ in the divine service. And in that section, he actually presents specs for how to build an organ that is perfect for the divine service. And his final section of worship is entitled Leadership. So that would be leadership of the divine service. He spends an entire chapter on the minister and his part in the divine service, a chapter on vestments, a chapter on ceremonial. He's got a full, 15, 16 pages on the celebration and administration of Holy Communion. And then he moves back to music, and he's got a chapter on the organist and the choir master, and then on musical accompaniment and interpretation. And then he goes to a full chapter on chanting. That's 12 pages long. And, of course, we've seen in SB&H, Service Book and Hymnal, that he's going to bring some of the old Greek and Latin forms into the liturgy. And he talks about chanting, and then the administration of a choir, And then he ends with a very interesting chapter on the history of the liturgical movement. Now, in Service Book and Hymnal, there is also a section in the front of the hymnal that chronicles the history of liturgical reform in the Lutheran Church in America. And these are very valuable for Lutheran pastor because they introduce us to very interesting characters and titles. And in fact, one of them is Pro Ecclesia. And if you go online and Google Pro Ecclesia, all of the back issues of Pro Ecclesia are available online. And in the first edition, there's a bibliography, and that bibliography lists some of the works that these men used, our liturgical fathers, as they worked towards reform of the liturgy in the Lutheran Church in America. So it really is an opportunity to meet our fathers as we read his chapter in worship and then the introduction to the liturgical reform as he has it in the service book and hymnal. So with the permission of the host, I'll move on to the service book and hymnal.
No, you do not have my permission. Yeah, of course.
Oh, well, I guess we have to stop. Yeah. So the copy of Service Book and Hymnal that I'm holding in front of me is a printing in 1958, and it lists 8 Lutheran bodies, and it is printed over and over again from 58 to 61, and after that, I don't have anything in my library that touches on this. I do have, probably 125 or 130 books on my liturgy shelf. But for a service book and hymnal, I stop in 1961. So service book and hymnal is a comprehensive hymnal. And I would say, for me, it's got some very important features, very interesting features, with looking backwards on the development of the liturgy among American Lutherans. First would be the return of the Eucharistic prayer. In history, before the Reformation, there are no liturgies, East or West, that don't have a Eucharistic prayer. And of course, Luther's excision of the canon set Lutherans up to go forward without a Eucharistic prayer. And you've heard me talk before, I think, about my theory that in the 1526 Deutsche Messe, where Luther inserts this long exhortation to communicants where the canon was cut out, he actually includes anamnesis language that's very similar to parts of the canon that were excised. So I think Luther is sensible of this. And the sensibility of service book and hymnal is to retain what Luther and the reformers did, but at the same time look for the good in earlier and more historic liturgies. And I have just a real short quote, and this is in Reed's preface to the liturgy in Service Book and Hymnal. At the same time that our churches in America have come more fully to appreciate each other, they have also discovered, through deepened scholarship and broader fellowship, the rich treasury of ecumenical liturgy, especially in the ancient Greek tradition, antedating the Roman Rite, from which our European usage has been derived. A vision clearer than was sometimes possible in the turmoil of the Reformation controversy has revealed the enduring value of some elements which were lost temporarily in the 16th century reconstruction of the liturgy. And I think that paragraph, which, if you're following, is found on Little Roman numeral page 7 in the preface, I think that really sets up everything that follows in Service Book and Hymnal. It is a retention of the Lutheran form, but the sensibility is more ancient, and they are not afraid to reach back into the old liturgies and bring things that they deem to be good forward.
Now, let me ask you, how was that received at the time when it is first released? And did the rubrics that accompany some of those ancient rites come with it?
Some do, although, for instance, in peace let us pray to the Lord, Lord have mercy for the peace that is from above, etc. Um, that's in a different place in this liturgy. It's not the entrance litany, but it is there, and it's pointed musically to two different settings. So how it was received, I think, because SB and H, Service Book and Hymnal, was widely used in those Lutheran churches. Now they're not in communion with Missouri, but in those churches, these are widely used, and this did unify 8 different Lutheran bodies, Service Book and Hymnal. So that's a pretty significant reception, and I can name those bodies: the AELC, the ALC, the Augustana ELC, the ELC, the Finnish ELC in America, the Lutheran Free Church, the UELC, and the ULCA. So those end up being part of that kind of quasi-denominational ELCA that presents itself today. And so those are the forerunners. But the reception, I would say, was very good. One of the things that I'm not going to talk about at all is the Service Book and Hymnal Altar Book. But if you can get a hold of a used copy of that, and you're making homebound visitations, that's equally as usable as Father Heath Curtis's Daily Mass book, because it's got everything in it you need. Okay, so continuing then in this idea of reaching back, I mentioned earlier that a number of the chant tones in Service Book and Hymnal are identified as having come from the Missa Orbis Factor, which is the 11th setting of the Latin Mass. It is a Gregorian setting, and it was used in the Sundays per annum. And so the service is presented. There are 2 settings of the service presented. The first is very faithful to common service book, although it includes full musical notation in 4 parts for all of the ordinaries. And it includes a third setting for the offertory, which shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me, as part of the offertory. And so it does offer choices. Now, it only gives one Kyrie, and it gives an alternate for the simple, Lord have mercy upon us, Christ have mercy upon us. But it offers, in peace let us pray to the Lord, Lord have mercy for the peace that is from above, for the salvation of our souls, let us pray to the Lord, Lord have mercy. So if you're following, that's in the first setting of the Divine Service on page 17 in Service Book and Hymnal. It's very good about attribution of translation and of musical notation. Almost every section where there's printed music, it attributes it to someone. And then the Nicene Creed is presented, 3 settings of the offertory, the fourth being the musical setting of Psalm 51. And then it brings it at the prayer of the church. Then you get the choice between going on to communion or the ante-communion. And then this is really where SB&H sets itself apart, and that is that after the preface and the appointed proper preface, we have the Sanctus, and then after the Sanctus, we have the great prayer of thanksgiving, in which the Verba Domini are embedded and the Verba Domini are prayed. So this is quite different than what we read in Luther about the need for the proclamation of the Verba Domini. They are included here in the prayer. And the words of the prayer, it's a 3/4 of a page. It's quite a large prayer, and it would be common. Many of our guys would recognize the language of this prayer. Holy art thou, Almighty and merciful God. Holy art thou, and great is the majesty of thy glory. Thou didst so love the world as to give thine only begotten Son, etc., etc. And then the Verba Domini come right after that. And then you have the anamnesis, remembering therefore his salutary precept, his life-giving passion, etc. And that gives way to the Lord's Prayer after the consecration. Now, Luther has a form that's not too different than that, with the Lord's Prayer after the consecration, but the praying of the Verba Domini really does distinguish this from the 1523 Formula Missae and the 1526 Deutsche Messe. And then there is an alternate given, and the rubric is here, or instead of the above, the the minister may say the words of the institution, followed by the Lord's Prayer. And then it just has the straight Verba Domini and the Lord's Prayer spoken.
Mhm.
And then the minister turns to the congregation and sings, "The peace of the Lord be with you alway," not always, alway. And the congregation responds, "And with thy spirit." And then comes the Agnus Dei. And there are two settings given. One is from Braunschweig in 1528. The other is a plain song setting from a Swedish missal. And the distribution, the Nunc Dimittis after the distribution, it offers four prayers after communion. The first being Luther's, so we give thanks to the Almighty God, and then the final blessing with the Aaronic benediction. The second setting of the service is substantially the same words, but it's a different musical setting. And there are musical attributions throughout. But it seems like the Bohemian Brethren of 1544 and the Swedish Missal and the Missa Orbis Factor. I'm sorry. These are the main sources of the chant tones. And then there's an apology offered in the introduction that a third setting isn't presented. And the apology includes an explanation of why it's not presented, but it directs towards some old Reformation era church books to find that setting. And I haven't done any work on that, but I think it's an interesting inclusion in an introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So then after that, the hymnal follows. It's a very full hymnal. It includes the proper prefaces with musical notation, and then all the introits, collects, lessons, epistles, graduals, and gospels. And in this case, the scriptures are listed only by the name of the book and the verses, but the propers themselves, introit, collect, etc., are written out completely. And following that, you have matins and vespers. There is a section where the graduals for the season are all pointed. And then after matins and vespers, you have suffrages, litany, and then the psalms, but not all of them, like our modern hymnals don't include all of the psalms.
Mm.
A rite for public confession, a burial rite that is pointed for singing, and following that, a marriage rite, a section on general rubrics with the table of movable feasts, and a little bit of help by ranking for precedence of festivals. And if you're working on the calendar for next year, February 2 is going to be a difficult one to rank. So the table on page 278, Service Book and Hymnal, can be of help.
Now, I wanted to ask you about, so how inclusive was was the sanctoral calendar within Service Book and Hymnal?
The calendar they present is substantially the same calendar as the Common Service Book, and the sanctoral mentions are the ones that we would know, the big feasts of Christ and those the observance of saints' days. They call these lesser festivals, but the least of the festivals that they treat are apostles, evangelists, and martyrs. Those would be named martyrs. And then the presentation, the visitation, the annunciation, transfiguration, and St. Michael. And interestingly, St. Michael and all angels put together. So there isn't a list here in the ranking that identifies a full sanctoral calendar. Leah certainly has that. And Dr. Benjamin Mays has put into English translation two of Leah's liturgical calendars with a sanctual observance on every day of the year.
Hmm.
Uh, and then there's a brief introduction, and they call this the common hymnal, even though the title is Service Book and Hymnal. And then we get some 600 hymns broken into seasons of the year, and also by theme of the hymn. And then there's a section in the back of 2 or 3 pages that's just doxologies, and then a full, for instance, we talk a lot about the old 100th. There's an old 124th. Who knew?
Mm-hmm.
It's from the Genevan Psalter. Well, of course, musicians know, and they're all laughing right now that I said that. But and then there's a full set of indexes in the back of the hymnal. So the idea behind this was to talk a little bit about Luther Reed, his history, and also the 4 big books that he either wrote or was a principal in the production
Mm-hmm.
of. There's another book written by Luther Reed, published by the ULCA, and the title is Collects and Prayers for Use in the Church. And that is 1935, and that includes pointing.
Hmm.
Another Luther Reed title is, and it's a little longer title, The Psalter, and canticles pointed for chanting to the Gregorian psalm tones, with a plain song setting for the order of matins and vespers, accompanying harmonies, and tables of proper psalms for the use of evangelical Lutheran congregations. And that is the General Council Publication Board of 1901. He also has several published musical settings. He has one that's simply called the Responsories, musical settings. He has a musical setting called Season Vespers, and this is containing the full text of the Vespers service with a hymn of invocation, the authentic music of the responses, and of the proper antiphons, psalms, and canticles for every season of the church year, and the authentic music of the litany and the suffrages with accompanying harmonies for the organ. That's a 1905 date, and he is one of 3 authors of the music and the language. And then about Luther Reed, there are a couple of books that are very interesting. I mentioned earlier that CPH has a title, Luther Reed, The Legacy of a Gentleman and a Churchman, and that is by Philip Fothtiker. And then Luther Reed and the Lutheran Liturgical Renewal in America, that's a title by Harold Thomas Fries, and it was published in 1966 by the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. So not only books by Reed, but books about Reed.
So
Now, yeah, go ahead, please.
So, what do you think Reed's overarching legacy for us would be?
I think Reed is a bold reformer in a way that other liturgists at the time or liturgiologists at the time were not, in his willingness to reach back into the early church and find elements that had been lost during the Reformation and return them in an appropriate Lutheran way. I think the downside of some of the things that went on with service book and hymnal is there was an unhealthy ecumenicity that followed in all these church bodies getting together when they really actually didn't have the same confession. And I think that in liturgical renewal you get that. I mean, look at our side. We had the same thing certainly. You've got guys like Pete Korn and Weber and Vismar and von Schenken, the St. James group. And there was a little bit of an unhealthy ecumenicity in that as well. And so I think that that goes together with it hand in hand. Now that's a personal opinion. To people who are actually scholars, I would leave the work of answering that. But I do think that including language from the early liturgies, and then also bringing back the Eucharistic prayer, which is right. It was taken out during the Reformation for very good reason, and Luther certainly didn't have the luxury of the ability to sit down and craft a liturgy. He simply took what he had and cut parts out. And he talks about that a lot in volume 53 of the American edition. He says, here we retain what we've always used. Well, and what we've always used is in the Latin Missal. And so I think that Reed was bold in that respect. And also, they did end up leaving to the church 4 significant books that the Lutheran pastor inside of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod can use as a great resource, as a learning tool for understanding liturgical renewal and the relationship between our liturgy and the earliest of the liturgies. We have Acts 2:42 forward. We have Didache. We have apostolic tradition, Hippolytus of the 3rd century. We have the apostolic constitutions of the 4th century. We have Ordo Romanus Primus of the 9th century, a full rite with the installation of a bishop. And we can see in these, if you have a copy of Brightman, Ancient Liturgies East and West, you can go back to the Byzantine liturgies, the Liturgy of St. James, and you can see, the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. Hearts above, we have them with the Lord. Let us give thanks unto the Lord our God. It is meet and right so to do. These are common. They bind us with 2,000 years of difference to our fathers in the faith and those who have gone before us.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'd like to make one comment. I was amazed as I did the research here. I have a lot of books in print on my shelf, but I also went online to some of the musical libraries to pull down Reed titles. And I was amazed that if there is a Wikipedia article on Luther Reed, I couldn't find it.
Wow.
It seems like somebody ought to write something on Luther Reed on Wikipedia.
Maybe, sounds like you have a ministry for that.
Yeah, you're right. That's my calling. But I thought what we might do. Luther Reed did write a hymn. The title of the hymn is "O God of Wondrous Grace and Glory," and it's a 5-stanza hymn. There's an introductory hymn to the Trinity, and then 3 stanzas, one each to each person of the Holy Trinity, and then a closing stanza. This is stanza 4. O God, whose grace and power supernal endure through time itself decay, our strength renew with life eternal, crown all who seek and find the way. Thy word, O God, the Spirit's sword, give peace in our time, O Lord. You can find the full hymn in Service Book and Hymnal number 353. So I think it's completely appropriate to let Luther Reed have the last word.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your study on this and for walking us through all the sources and the biographical sketch. He sounds like an amazing liturgical scholar and also just someone who's connected to what Lutherans stand for and how we teach and hand on the faith. I can't wait to meet him when we find ourselves in the glorious company of the angels and the archangels in heaven. So thanks again for your time, Mark, and I look forward to having you on again.
Thank you for the opportunity to do the study, and I will be glad to be with you in the future.